All right, I think we're going to get started now. So again, everyone, welcome to DebateX. As a reminder, we're going to be recording the session and we'll share a copy and a recap with the group later on. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dan Abelon. I'm a partner here at Two Sigma Ventures. We're an early stage venture fund. We invest in data-driven companies across different industries, usually at the Series A stage. And we are very lucky to have Shahin from Lux Capital, Alice from Rooke VC, Jenny from Genoa Ventures, and Nnamdi from 645 Ventures joining us for our fourth DebateX, which also happens to be the first virtual DebateX. So what is DebateX? DebateX is our Churchill Club style debate where we invite experts from around the tech community to each present a thesis on a specific trend or topic. For today's discussion, each of the panelists will be answering this question. When we look back 10 years from now, what will have been the most non-obvious and lasting impact of COVID-19? So here's how it's going to work. Each panelist will have 3 minutes to present their thesis, after which the other panelists will show whether they agree or disagree by holding up their high-tech ping pong paddles. Everyone show the ping pong paddles. Thank you. Showing either red or green. So you'll be able to see a vote in favor of a topic means that the panelists found it both compelling but also non-obvious. And a vote against means that either they don't agree or they thought it was too obvious. So after each person presents their thesis, each of the other panelists will have 2 minutes as rebuttal time to basically say whether they agree or disagree. And then in the end, each panelist will have 3 minutes to defend their thesis. And then we'll repeat for each panelist and then hopefully have some time for audience Q&A at the end. If you'd like to ask any clarifying questions for any of the panelists, you can use the Q&A box below in Zoom. And then if we have time, we'll bring you on at the end to ask your follow-up question directly. So another fun element of this is that the audience, you the audience, can also participate throughout and you get to vote for the most compelling and non-obvious thesis as well. So we sent an email with this link very recently. It's pollev/TSV debate. So pollev.com/TSV debate. And you get to vote and you can, it's dynamic, so you can change it at any point as the various arguments sway you. So that URL was also sent in the webinar confirmation email that you just received. And you'll be able to see the results of that vote changing behind Mickey, who is the small person waving in front of us on screen, and you'll be able to see the results there. So thanks again to each of the panelists for sharing your views and for all of you for joining us. And before we dive into the answers, I want to give each panelist 30 seconds to intro themselves and their background. So why don't we start with you, Nnamdi?
Well, it's great to be a part of this. So I'm Nnamdi Okike. I'm co-founder of 645 Ventures. We're a seed to Series A VC fund in New York. We focus primarily on enterprise software, so enterprise SaaS, enterprise infrastructure. Started the fund about 6 years ago now after spending my early career at Insight Venture Partners. We're on our third fund, so we're $150 million fund 3. We typically invest at seed, so average check is about $1 million. We can also invest at Series A. And yeah, excited to be part of this today.
Thanks, Nnamdi. How about you, Alice?
Hi, everyone. This is Alice Lloyd George, founding partner of Rooke VC, seed fund focused on frontier tech and virtual culture. I was formerly at RRE Ventures in New York for 5 years. And yeah, prior to that, I had a few other careers that I'll talk about in my thesis presentation, I guess. So happy to be here.
Great, Shahin?
Hey guys, I'm Shahin. I'm a partner at Lux Capital. We're an early stage technology and healthcare focused venture capital firm. I joined 13 years ago. I have a background in electrical engineering. I've led investments in chips, rockets, satellites, driverless cars, manufacturing automation, robotics, and I'm really excited to be here.
Great, Jenny.
Thanks, Dan. Hello, everyone. This is Jenny Rooke from Genoa Ventures in San Francisco, California, founder and managing director there at the firm. We focus on leading first institutional rounds for companies innovating where biology and technology converge. Everyone on the team, including myself, has deep technical expertise in relevant areas. My PhD's in genetics, as well as with operating and investing experience. We think this is really important for really partnering with our early stage companies, getting them from 0 to 1 to 100 in those critical early years of startup and early growth.
Awesome. All right, so we're going to start with Shahin. I'm going to give a quick overview of Shahin's thesis, and then he will get to present for 3 minutes. So the title of this thesis is People Will Get Closer. In the last decade, social media has created a false sense of community and affirmation. We have thousands of followers, attract hundreds of likes, swipe left on scores of potential mates, but we're lonelier than ever. The more time we spend apart during COVID, the more we long for community. And when we ultimately overcome this pandemic, we'll crave and seek genuine human relationships. So I'll leave it at that. Over to you, Shahin, for 3 minutes.
So I'm not an expert by any means in kind of, social psychology. But what I've observed over the past, say, 20 years, social media has evolved from a forum where, like-minded people could exchange ideas to a broader kind of ecosystem that has created the kinds of negative effects that we're seeing right now. Fake news can be one of those side effects as well. But I think one of the more important side effects of social media is one where people have a false sense of community, whereas they may have hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of connections or followers and may get tens or hundreds of likes on a photo or on a statement, whereas in reality, those are kind of passing and not quite real, and people feel very alone. So prior to COVID, people had a lot of social interaction. And as a result of that, that loneliness probably was somewhat masked. But unfortunately, now that people are in their homes, they're starting to realize and appreciate the value of true human connection. And what a lot of social media fails to do is create that true and real human connection. And I do think that creates an opportunity for founders, for companies to explore how we can recreate the true human connection that had been lost over the past 20 years or had been neglected over the past 20 years, and now is becoming a very acute challenge and problem. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'll give back the remainder of those 3 minutes.
Okay, great. So remember, the question is, to what extent is this a compelling and long-lasting thesis, but and also non-obvious? So let's see those paddles. Wow, looks like it's unanimous if my hue on my screen is correct. All right, Jenny, why don't we start with you?
I appreciate getting to go before the culture expert, because I'm neither a representative customer nor a culture expert like Alice is. But certainly I agree with the loneliness and the isolation. I think that is a topic of discussion. People are being made aware of that. I feel bad for saying this, but I'm a cynic, though, that once things return to some kind of normal, whatever that is, that awareness of the value of human connection is going to somehow overcome all of the things that made social media what it is: the dopamine hits, the hungry for the new thing, the newest platform, frankly, just the laziness, the convenience, the pressures of our lives. So even though I, as an extreme introvert, am longing to go back to in-person parties, I don't think that this changes our long-term behavior as it pertains to social media.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Nnamdi.
So I think it's a really interesting thesis. I definitely think it's non-obvious. I think it's contrarian. So I was debating whether I agree with it or not. I have to say I don't agree for a couple of reasons. I think for a few reasons. I think first of all, kind of virtual communication, like we're communicating now, I think people have seen the value of that. I think people have seen the value of being able to interact in a different way. And I think the convenience of that, the proliferation of that, and plus the cost of being closer to people, both in terms of health risks today, but even over the long term, in terms of travel and things like that. I think the nature of relationships will change. I think unfortunately, it will mean that generally, I think you're not as close to as many people as you might have been. It may mean that you're closer to a smaller number of people. So maybe that you can interact more frequently with your parents, your loved ones virtually. But I do think overall, in terms of in-person communication and the nature of kind of close in-person relationships, I feel like overall they will likely decline. So I think I agree with the points that Jenny made.
Alice, what do you think?
I was finding the mute button. I think it's really interesting, and I actually don't disagree that, you know, there is some shift around social media in general, and that people will value like the physical world and real world relationships. I think that's right, but I think that it's the difference is that I think what we're going to see is different types of relationships forming in different types of virtual communities as maybe we move away from unhealthy social media. And I think that there's a lot of people who've found solace from the loneliness during the pandemic and things like gaming, right? Which is a whole different types of like people coalescing around shared interests like Fortnite or Minecraft servers. And I also think that our realities are different now in that, you know, shared like WhatsApp groups or chat groups mean so much more than they did before the pandemic. That's like our tie to our friends. So I actually think we're going to have trusted, smaller virtual groups that probably like are a response to disinformation actually. So I think that I agree with that part, but I don't think it means, I just think it means that social media is changing and the nature of our virtual relationships is changing rather than, you know, I guess the original thesis.
All right. Well, Shahin, you got 3 red paddles. What do you say to the other panelists?
So I'm actually relieved because I thought all the red paddles would mean that, oh, this is so obvious, of course, you know, and I'm very happy to hear that folks are saying it was non-obvious and they disagree with me. So I like that because the whole purpose is for this to be non-obvious. I agree with everything that every panelist said. Jenny, 100%, like the dopamine hit, the addiction that we have right now, that is going to be extremely difficult to overcome. Nnamdi, like, yeah, I mean, I used to have, you know, 10 meetings a day and I'd be exhausted, you know, in person. And now I can just bang out, you know, 10 plus meetings and be on top of my email and grab other calls, you know, get stuff done as they come up. And Alice, to your point, like with the virtual worlds, there's so many other forums now where we can create that human connection. You know, it may be in over 10 years, but I think the people will be quick to forget. People, we all remember 9/11, but we all flocked back into New York. I mean, Tribeca was one of the most valuable pieces of real estate, you know, in New York, even though 9/11 happened, you know, 17, 18 years prior. So I think we'll be quick to move back to kind of the intimate and physical. But like to what extent, you know, who knows? And all the concerns and the facts the panelists brought up, I 100% agree.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Shahin. Appreciate it. Just a reminder to the audience to use that link in your email to vote. Mickey is pointing at the screen behind him. You know, perhaps people are waiting to hear some of the other theses before they vote, which is fair. So next up, we are going to hear from Jenny. So Jenny's thesis is Innovation Hubs Reassert Dominance. The results of a decade-long experiment are showing that in-person matters and a local critical mass of resources is required for starting and scaling the very best innovation-based companies. The next generation's hungry innovators once again flock to the hubs, conferring disproportionate power to ecosystem players who have stayed local, strengthening their brands and networks. Over to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Dan. Right, so that's my thesis, that at the 10-year mark, hubs like the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and Cambridge reassert and reemerge as the unquestionably dominant centers for top quality startup creation, funding, and early growth. This is a non-obvious prediction for many of the same trends we were just talking about. There's obviously so much force now for remote work. We're developing the skills and the technology and the flexibility, both as employers and employees, to be productive anywhere. And as Alice was saying, we're also figuring out how to stay connected, use those other tools for adding the other elements of, you know, of being a worker and being connected. It's also a non-monotonic prediction. So it doesn't just grow like usual. I think we'll see a pendulum swing, such that in the next 5 years or so, it may look like innovation is becoming more evenly distributed. And I think it plays out like this. We get this diaspora, we're in it now, the T0 to 2 years. Remote work flourishes, mid to late stage private companies, as well as public companies are supportive of innovation workers, like tech workers working from anywhere. And we get teams setting up and figuring this out, and that's great. And then you get in the kind of 2 to 5 year time frame, our next generation of founders who maybe are leaving the Facebooks, leaving their existing companies to start the next thing. And hey, they're already in Boulder, they're already in Utah, why not try it there? And so we see this really exciting, less concentrated distribution of startups happening. Angel funding is plentiful, ecosystem developers are excited, that's gonna be great. But then around the 5 year mark, we start to see a separation from the pack, and non-hub founders rediscover what we've known for decades, which is that starting and building a company is one of the hardest things you can possibly do voluntarily as a human. And the whole world is against you, and all of the trends are against you, and you're trying to be disruptive. And in that setting, you want all of the decks stacked for you that you can possibly have. You want access to the best talent, the best capital for scaling. And being in person turns out to matter for moving fast, thinking big, getting that energy from your collaborators, really figuring it out in that kind of 0 to 1 time frame. And so in that sort of midpoint, we get this bimodal distribution of value creation starting to appear. The breakout winners are once again happening at the hubs. So by the 10-year time frame, that's why I say the results are in of the experiment. The up-and-comers who are hungry to win at all costs come back to the hubs, and the hub-based winners, anybody who has stayed and made their stand, have disproportionate power because they have an extra decade of network building. And so it's almost a reset to the early thousands in terms of the startup landscape. So that's my thesis, and it really depends on some secret kind of missing ingredients from the current distributed framework that I'm happy to talk about as well. But I'll pause there, see what people think.
Thank you, Jenny. Well said. So the universe doesn't just keep expanding, but it expands and then contracts back to those hubs. What do the other panelists think? Is that a green and 2 reds? Okay. Why don't
Love it. Split the room is a good outcome.
Let's stay positive, Shahin. Let's keep going with the agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't put that much thought into the expansion and contraction aspect, but I do think that we're in a phase right now where people are overreacting. I mean, people in general just overreact to things, and we're saying, okay, everything's going to be distributed. New York and San Francisco are going to be gutted out, and we're going to have companies starting in Omaha, Nebraska. I do believe that there is still an element of concentration of people that makes those geographies where people are concentrated advantaged. And so I do expect to be, I do expect flight from innovation centers like, San Francisco, Boston, Los Angeles, Austin, that are hubs today. But I do expect those other cities, Denver has been discussed, Charlotte, these others, Atlanta, these other cities, to thrive. They may never reach the scale of these other major tech hubs, but I do expect there to be more distributed, but not completely distributed, pockets of innovation. And I don't think we're going to get back to the same level of concentration that we have right now. But I think there will be continued but more distributed concentration of talent and companies in the future.
Good. Okay. How about you, Alice?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I did read, but it's not obviously 100% disagreement. I think it's just similar to what Shahin was saying, I do think it depends on the hub. Like, I think if people were congregating for work reasons versus social reasons, which you could say is like a San Francisco versus New York thing, broad sweeps, like I do think it will be harder for Silicon Valley and San Francisco and big companies like Facebook that could do the work distributed. So I think it depends, like the things that can be distributed will be, because a lot of people prefer the flexibility. And so a lot of that will be software. I do think for deep tech, I agree with you, or bio, I think, which you focus on as well, that you do need to be in person, and some of those just won't change, you know, hardware. But I do think for software, there is some change. And I also think it relates to more of the just like gig economy, and, you know, how the job markets are changing in general. So, and sort of asynchronous work, I think, will become a real thing as well. But it's definitely an interesting thesis.
Nnamdi, you were red.
I was, and I do think this is an interesting thesis as well, and definitely contrarian. And I think I agree with some aspects of it. I would probably break it down based on type of industry. I do agree with Alice's point. I think certain companies will always, you know, be built in hubs. These are companies that either are dependent upon certain physical assets, whether they be, you know, semiconductor plants, or, you know, certain you know, hardware companies, or certain companies where the combination of kind of physical infrastructure needed combined with like certain places where that talent seems to be located. I think those companies will remain in the hubs. But I think overall, I think there are a lot of factors that would lead you to believe that you'll see democratization. Everything from the reduction in cost needed to start a company, you know, proliferation of cloud services, the fact that people are getting more familiar with working remotely, and also the fact that you can kind of pull talent, like exceptional talent, for lower cost from a lot of different places, which you've seen in certain, you might describe as kind of less advanced industries that have been outsourced or kind of moved to other geographies where cost is lower. I think you'll see more of that in our world. I think sometimes we believe that we have a lot of unique skills that can only be done in one place, but I do believe that a lot of those things will be done in other places. So I think cost will drive distribution as well. So I think overall, I disagree, but I think there are some nuances, definitely. And I think certain types of companies will remain in the hubs. And you might even argue that the very big winners, you know, the kind of, you know, $100 billion companies, they may be in those hubs.
The group makes a strong case for geographic democratization. Jenny, what do you say to that? You have the last word on this one.
Yeah, a great discussion. And I'm going to double down on the nut of the thesis, which is just what Nnamdi just said. I'm talking about the breakout winners. Where do you start them? And I would argue that's not limited to certain industries, because what's missing in the Zoom factor, what's missing in the virtual channels, is the magic things that make winning startups. And those are things like serendipity and trust and the energy and camaraderie that happens from being together as people. So when the three people get together and start a thing and it wins, they're going to say, we got to do that where most of the resources are, where we have our best chance of building industry changing companies. And that'll be at the hubs. I'll also say this is a self-serving thesis, because I've decided to make my stand and stay here in San Francisco. So as I watch my colleagues move to cheaper and greener, literally greener pastures, this is how I tell myself I'm doing the right thing.
Great. All right. Thanks, Jenny. Good. Okay. So the next thesis we have is Nnamdi's. Glad people are starting to vote. You can see behind Mickey, we have some interesting results starting to appear. People have not heard Nnamdi's thesis yet, but he's getting some good support. Okay, so I'll dive right in. So keep voting, folks. So Nnamdi's thesis is, our most important institutions will be fundamentally transformed. Institutions shaping our daily lives and work, in particular corporations, small businesses, and universities, will be fundamentally transformed by COVID-19. They will shift from being organizations structured based on physical presence and localized affinity groups to becoming virtual organizations structured based on shared skills, interests, and affinities. So I'm going to stop there. And this is a little bit counter to the last thesis we heard. I'm so excited to hear from you, Nnamdi.
Great, so I'll jump in. So, you know, our important life decisions have always been driven by localized presence. So most of us live in close proximity to where we work. We make life choices based upon things like the quality of local school systems for our kids or the cost of real estate. You know, our organizations have historically been driven by these physical constraints. So the whole concept of a corporation is to aggregate talent locally and enable people to work closely together. You know, small businesses often choose where to locate based upon where they think local demand is greatest. And our university systems are typically structured based upon physical presence. So you go to college, it's in person, you have in-person interaction, you're in a campus. I believe that those traditional norms and organizations were already cracking and falling apart before COVID-19. So for example, startups and tech companies had shown that virtual work and virtual organizations could work very well, and you could be more productive and you could be more profitable as an organization. You know, working parents were demanding flexible work that enabled them to balance family and kids. That's always been the case, but traditional corporations haven't been able to enable that to work very well. And finally, there's been a rise of online education, but that's really demonstrated the unsustainability of traditional business models of universities. So for example, MIT put its entire course curriculum online in 2007, 13 years ago. But for some reason, the cost of college education has continued to rise at 8x the rate of wages over the last decade. I believe that these things are not sustainable. And I think that COVID-19 has really demonstrated and shown that these institutions need to change fundamentally. So what does that look like? You know, so I believe that COVID-19 is a tipping point that will force change. The first institution to change will be the corporation. So I believe that corporations, one, will shed their commercial real estate in high volumes. You know, the commercial real estate market today is $6 trillion in the United States. I believe that market will decline. I believe a lot of big companies will get rid of their physical offices and likely move to more virtual organizations. I believe that business travel is going to be reduced. That's probably obvious. That's a $400 billion market. I think that will decline significantly. I think small businesses, the economics of small businesses will change as well. And I think this is less obvious. So when you think about a small business, typically it's highly dependent upon location. So if you're a small retailer, you need to be in a place where the foot traffic is greatest. Or if you're a restaurant, you want to be in a place where, you know, that cuisine is popular. I believe that a lot of small businesses will have to change. And I think ones that are dependent upon local foot traffic or in-person interaction will likely decline or go out of business. And I think the importance of physical location for small businesses will change. And I think companies like Peloton will start to take over certain industries, for example, the gym industry. So you move from kind of in-person interaction to virtual interaction. I think finally, universities, I think their business models will change dramatically. I think some experts have estimated that 20 to 25% of colleges will go bankrupt. And I think that will be the case. I think we'll move more to virtual education. And I think there's a reasonable chance that our kids, a lot of our kids will go to universities that are primarily virtual. So I think overall, I think there will be a change in terms of our institutions. And I think that will really transform our daily lives in a lot of ways.
Thanks, Nnamdi. So while the panel is considering what color to vote, I'll just remind everyone, feel free to use the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and then and keep voting, everyone. So everyone raise their paddles. Green and 2 reds. Why don't we start with you, Jenny?
Sure. My red is mostly because I agree, and it's not clear to me how it's transformative or non-obvious. Business travel is already changing. Small businesses were already less dependent on local. I mean, that's called the internet, right? And the only part of it I probably don't agree with is education being transformed to be primarily virtual, and say anybody who's got school-age kids would say, oh God, please no, right? So it's a mixture of things that I think just continue and maybe accelerate existing trends, as well as the places where I think the thesis has something truly transformative. I do believe for the better that education will have more of a virtual component as people have the skills to incorporate it, but I don't see it being fundamentally transformed, unfortunately. So that's my mix of objections.
Shahin, you are also red.
Yeah, sorry, my AirPods. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So I'm in Jenny's camp. I agree with everything Nnamdi said, and I actually also agree with the educational aspect that Jenny disagreed with. If you look at our choice of habitation over time, like in the medieval times, we lived close to our tribes in fear of enemies. And then, fast forward in the feudal systems, we lived on arid, on farming, on land that we could farm, and then, go to the industrial age, it was living close to factories. And so, we've always had the pattern of living in a place where we could work and be close to our families and be happy. And I think over time, the constraints have been reduced over the centuries. We know, up to 1,000 years ago, people worried about being, attacked and pillaged. And then up to, 500 years ago, it was about employment and being able to make a living. And now it's going to be about where we want to work and where we want to live. Well, where we want to live, really, like where we like the weather and where we're close to our families and loved ones. And those other constraints that Nnamdi was talking about, which is, showing up to an office and, university and school system, all those things are going to be less of a factor. And so I agree with everything that he said, but I just think it's obvious, and it's a continuation of a trend that we've had over many years.
Thank you. All right, Alice, sounds like you thought it was non-obvious and a compelling thesis. So you voted green?
Yeah, I guess I sort of slightly forgot about the non-obvious part. I do largely agree. I guess I'm not changing my vote, but I think the education part is actually the core part, because the other pieces are, I think we can largely agree on a lot of virtualization and digitization of different parts of the economy. But I think that the nut of the education thing is that the value prop has to change. Like, there were these structural problems already there that I think the pandemic, has like highlighted. What are we actually paying for? The unbundling of education versus social versus like stamp of an institution. So I think that's the part that I don't know how obvious it is to outside of our circles of people that talk about it. I'm not sure that it's obvious to the rest of like the country right now how much education is going to change. So I'm going to keep my vote.
Okay, Nnamdi, you have a few minutes to conclude.
Yeah, so I think you guys made great points, and I think a lot of this, I think the initial impacts are obvious in terms of changes in how corporations are structured or universities. I do think some of the second order effects may not be obvious. So if you think about how this may transform cities and what cities may look like in the future, I think there's a lot of kind of ancillary impacts that we haven't thought through. So for example, unemployment with small businesses, right? It's kind of how do we account for the fact that a lot of the businesses that have existed won't exist? And is there a safety net or a structure that can kind of account for these businesses and enable them to survive? How do we think about what will happen with the real estate industry and kind of all the folks that make their professions and lives based on physical real estate? Kind of what will happen in terms of, school systems, and what are the second order impacts of not necessarily having the in-person interaction? We talked about kind of the loss of that in terms of how our kids are educated, or even I think about going to university. A lot of my best friend groups are folks that I met in university in person. What will change? So I think there's kind of second order impacts that I haven't yet really been able to fully process, but I think they'll impact our society in pretty fundamental ways. And I think, it may be our government institutions, political institutions have to think about kind of how to account for those, but I think they will be relatively dramatic and, even to a larger extent than we might expect.
Great. All right. Thank you, Nnamdi. So a reminder to the audience, it looks like people are voting. Keep voting and make sure you take into account what you think is lasting as well as non-obvious. So for the last thesis, we're going to go to Alice, whose thesis is COVID-19 is accelerating China versus rest of the world tensions. US-China relations haven't been this bad in decades. This is due to both the stigma around the virus itself, reduced travel, the reappropriation of Hong Kong, and increasing techlash against Chinese companies. We will continue to see trade war skirmishes, and the tech Cold War will be playing out 10 years from now. Alice.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to a little bit of what I was saying about my background earlier. So I thought it'd be interesting to come at this question from geopolitics rather than VC. But prior to becoming a VC, I reported for the Wall Street Journal in Asia, covered kind of cybersecurity, US-China, worked for Brookings International Relations, They're a think tank based at Tsinghua in Beijing. And then I worked on the emerging markets team at Bridgewater. So like the macro perspective on China. So I'm coming at it from that because I thought it would be more interesting. Yeah, I think we probably all know that US-China relations have been getting worse for a couple of years now. But I think the pandemic is an accelerant. I think there's the stigma around the Chinese virus that you know, unfortunately Trump has been playing up a lot. You can see things like, you know, yesterday the Chinese military fired missiles into the South China Sea. We see a lot more flexing on both sides. Both I'm referring to US and China here. And I do think with the presidential campaign, there's going to be a lot of anti-China rhetoric, unfortunately, which will make, you know, it a higher stakes kind of escalation as well. And then I think, you know, there are other accelerants, which is obviously lack of travel. So less students in both countries learning each other's languages and cultures, and that will play out over the longer term. I think obviously like the protests in Hong Kong have now stopped, and because people don't have free movement to protest, and global attention is elsewhere now. And so we see the sort of digital dragnet closing in there and the new national security law. So I think that will cause tensions with the West 10 years from now. It will still be playing out. Twitter and Facebook have now temporarily cut off their data sharing with police in Hong Kong, Yahoo and Google changing terms of service and treating data requests differently. And I think obviously the tech clash has been in the press a lot with Huawei over the last few years, but also now TikTok and ByteDance. And I do think those are very different cases, but they are indicative of this broader tech clash in both directions. And I think what's hard to put our fingers on is really like how existing in different internets will affect our societies, different social media systems, growing up with different e-commerce. How does that play out? Like we're going to have very different realities of the world, especially as we spend more time in virtual worlds as we have two internets, you know? And so I think there's also implications for things like AI as we build different AI systems in these two very different ecosystems. And I looked at a study that MIT had done across 200 plus countries and how they would answer the trolley problem. And there really are national differences in terms of whether you choose to save old or young or pedestrian versus driver and all these different questions. So I think we can see that play out in automation, driverless cars, and things like that. But yeah, overall, I think the thesis here is that the historical battle for nation states is becoming a battle for cyberspace, and that's really one of the biggest impacts of the pandemic. The internet fault lines will just continue to become dangerous, and I do think probably Xi Jinping will hold power through at least 2027, 2032. I have no idea what's going to happen in the US or the West to our governments, but I do think that will escalate tensions as well. And we're going to see this sort of question of techno-authoritarian rule colliding with, you know, open internet. And we have our own questions here in the US about antitrust and big corporations and things like that. But I think the question I think about is like, you know, we always assume with technology, this like march of progress through history. And I don't know whether technology is necessarily going to be used as a tool, as a progressive tool versus a regressive tool. So yeah, I think I'm probably over 3 minutes, but that's my thesis.
Thank you, Alice. All right, let's take a second to reflect, and then how do we all vote? Wow, different from usual. 2 greens and a red. Let's start with the greens. Nnamdi.
So I like this thesis because I think it's not obvious, and it's definitely not one that I had thought about. You know, I think I like certain aspects of this, definitely. So, you know, if you think about the power of China and kind of their role and the fact that, you know, COVID-19 began there. And I think the fact that there may be a lot of kind of long-term results from that, especially in terms of the US and China kind of, you know, relationship. It's dependent upon obviously who's in power in the United States. I think if Trump remains in power, I think there's a higher probability that there continues to be huge friction there in terms of trade wars. But I think regardless, in terms of long-term, I think you do see China's role growing, especially if you think about things like AI and kind of their dominance there. I was recently reading a book called AI Superpowers, and it kind of described how far along China is in comparison to the US. And you could see, 20, 30 years from now, instead of physical wars, there being wars based upon, the quality of your bots and kind of the quality of your AI. So you could see, again, AI in the wrong hands are kind of precipitating certain things. So by no means am I an expert, but I do feel like this is very interesting. I think it's contrarian. I could see certain elements of this playing out. So I think overall, I agree.
Shahin, why don't we go with you next? Oh, you're muted.
There are parts of it that are obvious, but the important part that's not obvious is the duration of this effect. So we're talking about, 10 years. If you look historically, there have been crises, but these crises haven't lasted over a decade. You look at the Nazis, the communists, sure, it was multiple decades, but there's always something that followed up that wasn't quite expected. And here we're saying no, maybe it's not just 10 years, but even longer than 10 years, where there is a lot more here at stake, and what we're seeing right now could just be the beginning. So I feel like that Alice is right. This is a major issue. These tensions can and will increase regardless of what administration comes in after Trump, and that's something that we should be mindful of as a population.
Good. Okay, Jenny, so you were the one panelist who voted red. Tell us about it.
Right. And I voted red because I agree so strongly. And so having agreed out of the gate, I asked myself, is it obvious or non-obvious? And I flipped it on its head and asked, is there any non-obvious way in which it doesn't play out this way? And I can't think of one. Exactly the kind of tectonic factors that Alice described, the huge cultural differences, the long-term installment of leaders and their power, and the enormous innovation, divergent innovation that's happening as our backbone technologies that are about to transform our world, but separately, like divergent evolution, if you're familiar with this from biology. I don't see, to Shahin's point, I don't see how we resolve this in 10 years, given that. And I think Alice is absolutely right that the isolation and tension that is a function of the current COVID environment really is what makes it that long-term divergence that otherwise we might have seen a resolution in sooner.
So Alice, it seems like everyone generally agrees with you. Jenny thinks it's unfortunately really obvious that this is our destiny for at least the next decade. So how do you respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's obvious. I think to Shahin's point around, like, I think because the internet and smartphone penetration is so much higher now that it is a little different. Like, things don't just snap back to normal as soon as you change like the leader or something, because both in terms of things like, with Huawei, they're literally building telephone towers and building networks, and you can't like undo that. People are locked into this economic relationship with China when they, adopt Huawei, and similarly, like psychologically, it's very hard to reverse things when people have spent time in a different internet environment. So I think that that's the sort of duration question. And then there's aspects I didn't really go into that I'd love to with a fuller debate, which is like, what does it mean for Chinese entrepreneurs? If you look at like ByteDance, they really are going to struggle on the global stage if they can't go into other markets, right? We already know that like there's few tech targets for China to strike against. Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube are basically already banned. I think Microsoft is doing okay, but generally we already know the US direction. But for Chinese companies, like how will they be able to like tap into a bigger market? And I think that's probably tied to, what Chinese companies will be massive outside of China in 10 years as well.
Thank you, Alice. All right, so we've made it through our theses. As we're wrapping up, I'd love to encourage everyone in the audience to continue voting. It does look like we have a couple of questions that came in about long-term implications of COVID from the audience. Mickey, who do you have up first?
Yes, so let's bring Adam Pines onto the line. Adam, you should be able to ask your question. So go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. The question that I wrote in the chat was, it seems like Jenny specifically talked about or pointed at what basically is microeconomic cluster theory, and a lot of the discussion seemed to circle around that. Traditionally, cluster theories are based around geography, natural resources, fixed institutions, and as we move to a more like virtual, remote world, I'm wondering what are the drivers of the new cluster theory for microeconomics?
I guess I'll jump in since I sort of poked at this. I once saw a great investor panel, a decade ago, where the question was, when will we see the rise of new critical mass microeconomic clusters? What does it take for them to get over the barrier to being, at the same scale of some of the top, 3 or 4 leaders? And a very contrarian investor said they never will. It's too late. The flywheel is going. I think that might be an extreme answer, but I think what we've seen for decades now is that the physical proximity to a collection of resources and a culture, which does tend to be regional, that encourages innovation and connectivity amongst those resources is pretty hard to start without kind of the short list. Even virtually. And so again, I'll go back to, it's different when you're talking about startups versus just kind of overall economic development. And in startups, you need that serendipity, you need that connectivity, you need that energy. So I think we'll continue to see, as we've seen in the last decade plus, that other microeconomic clusters will continue to grow. I think those that specialize in areas that are maybe not already claimed, that are emerging, or that really play to their strengths, probably have the best chances of emerging as breakout, as opposed to competing kind of across the board on startups generally.
Any of the other panelists have thoughts on that one?
Well said.
All right, Mickey, you want to go on to the next one?
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. It looks like we have a question from Jonathan Pham. Hey, Jonathan, you're on the line now. Hey, you might have to unmute yourself, Jonathan.
Oh, okay. Thank you, guys. Hey, I just want to say thank you guys for taking your time. Glad to be upon. So my question is, many schools offer certificate/technical degrees and such that may, they may last for 6 months or a semester and such. But how would employers deem that worthy? Because that's becoming a really popular thing. An example would be from Stanford. They offer a how to pseudocode and how to flowchart something and whatnot, or how to innovate faster and better. So that's my first question. And my second question is that, what are your thoughts on the quality of in-person lectures versus virtually? I'll give you guys an example. I just started school again, and my calculus class has a total of 1,300 students with a cap of 300 students only allowed to be in the Zoom meeting. So yeah, what are your guys' thoughts?
I can dive into those. Are great questions, John. I can kind of give a couple of responses. So I think the traditional kind of thinking has been that, online education is good for certain disciplines, right? But it has drawbacks. Everything from, like you're describing, you don't have the in-person interaction. They've been perceived to be certificate worthy, so to speak, versus real degrees. But I think the difference between traditional in-person education and kind of virtual will blur. And I think what you're going to find is, and I think it's going to be more at the higher education level. I don't think it necessarily will take place at lower or middle school, but I do think kind of when you get to university or grad programs, you'll find people opting out of the in-person experience. Why? One, because of cost. So if you think of the cost of college education, it continues to go up dramatically. And if you think about the relative value of online curriculum, there will be certain students that will say, well, I can get at least as close to what I'm getting from an in-person experience for a lot less money, right? Not to mention you'll have certain schools like Lambda School and others that are much more tailored toward individuals getting a job and actually getting employed versus the traditional university system, which is oftentimes kind of learning, certain, disciplines, but that don't necessarily translate toward getting a job. And so I think traditional universities will have to adjust. And I think what you're going to find is there will be certain improvements. So if you think about a virtual course, at a place like MIT, which has put all of their courseware online for a long period of time, it may be restricted in terms of class size. You may still have opportunity to interact with professors one-on-one, but there's going to be much less of a going to school in person, going to classes physically. I think certain groups will opt out of that. In particular, students who don't have the financial means per se to afford higher education. I think that is a problem that continues to grow. So that's kind of my view of it. But I think it's going to be less cut and dry in terms of what's purely online versus purely offline, and also in terms of what degrees people get. I think there's going to be evolution there.
I would just add that I feel like as if the higher educational system here has enjoyed a monopoly for many years. They've been charging a rent by virtue of being aggregated, by benefiting from the serendipity that the students bring together, and those networks that are created. And now they're seeing they have a moment of reckoning where those whereby by taking the instruction online, they can no longer capture that or generate that rent. And I think that they have been kind of given a pass, because when it comes to any other product that we buy, whether it's a home or a car, which by the way doesn't cost a whole lot more than in the case of a home, than a college education these days, in most parts of the country, there's an expectation that that service or that product will last for a lifetime. Whereas in the case of higher education, if you don't get a job, or if you don't like your job, if you don't get paid enough to be able to pay down your college debt, it's on you, it's not on them. And I think there's going to be a sense of responsibility and accountability that will be put on higher education COVID, when people realize that, are we really getting what we're paying for?
Great. Well, I think we have time for one more question.
Cool. Yeah, it looks like we have one from Nicole. Hey, Nicole, you're on the line. You might have to unmute yourself.
That's great. Thanks so much. This has been such an interesting, different format, and first one that I've seen since the shutdown. So thank you for organizing. My question is short. Basically, our industries are not diverse enough and don't have gender parity. Is COVID going to make this worse or better?
Thanks, Nicole.
I think COVID is going to make it better. I think COVID is going to, I think it's leveling the playing field. Going back to the previous conversation about academic institutions, I feel like, technology has historically leveled the playing field. Back then, back in the day, hundreds of years ago, you had to be of a certain race to be able to own property. You had to be a male and to be of a certain race to be able to own property, period. And now, like we're still not quite there yet, but obviously we have a ways to go. But I think there's going to be more and more, by virtue of technology being able to give people the ability to contribute, regardless of gender or ethnicity or race. I think will further level the playing field. But again, we still have a long way to go. So I'm optimistic.
I'm
optimistic.
Optimistic. Oh, sorry.
Go for it.
I guess I agree with Shahin. I think women juggling many things is one of the issues, sort of expectations in every direction, and having the flexibility around work will make a big difference. I also think, to answer the last person's question on education, if we are, I think perhaps due to so many reasons, men tend to often dominate in person. And so in education, where you're submitting more essays or writing, and it's not about whose voice is the loudest, that may actually change things as well for women in education and work. And so yeah, I'm optimistic as well.
And I'm optimistic about the potential, but I don't think it gets there by virtue of the forces without us attending to it. So I really appreciate this question. It's super important. We're already seeing that COVID is a higher tax on many marginalized groups. The disparities in gender roles at the home, in attending to education and laundry, in many cases are getting exacerbated in this fantastic technology distributed moment. So many women are finding they're not able to take advantage of some of the flexibilities and the technology tools. So we have to, for any of us who care about this topic, we have to be very careful about that. We have to, I think this is a great forum for reminding ourselves to think about the long-term non-obvious effects and think about the sort of knock-on effects. For example, if you set up a flexible workplace environment where some people can come in and some people can work remote, that seems great. That seems like it might serve those marginalized groups better. But what happens when it's time for promotions? And people who have been in the office are top of mind or got to go out to drinks after. So we just have to make sure that our systems for assessing and rewarding merit keep up with these changes that could indeed open up quite a lot of opportunity.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, I think that's a great question to wrap up on. If everyone could just, in the audience, could take another second or two to finalize your vote. By the way, I love that last question. I think it gives us an opportunity to end on a hopeful note with everything going on around us. So it looks like, wow, the numbers are changing at the last minute, but let's pretty much lock it in here. It looks like I will declare that Jenny, by a hair, gets the most votes for the most non-obvious and lasting impact of COVID-19. But pretty close dispersion here. It seems like the audience and I certainly agree that I think all of the panelists did a fantastic job. So thanks again to all the panelists, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us for today's DebateX. Look forward to meeting back here in 10 years to see how all these events unfolded, hopefully sooner.
You should bet some Bitcoin on this, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea. How many Bitcoin would you like to bet?
Let's bet carry on our next fund.
Yeah, 0.01 Bitcoin. But anyways, thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Enjoy the rest of the day, and everyone stay safe out there. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us. This was great.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing. Loved it.